Minnesota Governor Tim Walz wants to open human rights offices in his state to fight Islamophobia. He made the announcement before a Council for American-Islamic Relations conference in St. Paul. The Justice Department has listed the council as an unindicted conspirator, saying the group helped fund Hamas. Following the governor's remarks, a panel of scholars, historians, and authors discussed the methods and impact of spreading hate.
To our presenters, thank you for bringing your insight and your expertise. This deep dive that we will go into Islamophobia and hate is needed. It is one that, as you can see, the community is ready to hear, and we welcome your insights, advice, and guidance. To everyone else who took time off, the students who are here and people, Minnesotans who took time to come here, thank you. As President Arthur said, those of you from Minnesota kind of know that I talk about one Minnesota a lot. This room is the embodiment of that, and I am grateful. We're here to try and understand what one Minnesota means, and I know you each embrace it, and it is in our diversity. When Mankato thrives, Minneapolis thrives, and when our Muslim community thrives, everyone thrives. We know that our Muslim community is deeply tied into the fabric of Minnesota. You are our teachers, our doctors, our entrepreneurs, our neighbors, our brothers and sisters. The cultural diversity that comes from the Muslim community has made Minnesota so much better, has strengthened our economy, and showed us who we can be. But I also know at this time, platitudes are not going to be enough. After the horrific events in Christchurch and a renewed focus on Islamophobia, so many in this room know Christchurch could have been and nearly was in our backyard at Dar al-Farouk. And those are our neighbors. That warm summer day just 2 years ago nearly avoided tragedy on an unbelievable scale, which we saw unfold in Christchurch. So I'm here today to deliver a pretty simple message. Hate and Islamophobia have no home in Minnesota, but you do. Our administration, along with my Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan and our commissioners, I'm joined here by one, our Education Commissioner, Mary Catherine Ricker, is here with us today, so thank you. We understand Mary Catherine's a lifelong educator, and we want to see actions, and our administration draws the line at zero tolerance. We will not have our Islamic youth bullied in our schools on a single day, in a single place, in a single community across Minnesota, and the commissioner is here to make sure that that happens. We will call out baseless attacks on our Muslim brothers and sisters at every chance, and we will hold accountable those politicians who choose to use this division to further their own careers at every single turn. We're also here to understand, again, what the presenters will tell us, we need to transform this into concrete actions. We need to change the culture and speak loudly, but we need to have the ability and the capacity to turn against Islamophobia, to talk about it in each of our communities. That's why our administration is preparing to open 3 new human rights offices in Worthington, in Bemidji, and Duluth. Those will be places where the law stands behind the rightness of what we're doing. It's a place of sanctuary for our citizens, and it's a place of education that will come out of conversations like this, how we can further this message, magnify it across the state. And the actions of the governor's office and the message that is very clear, and this is on behalf of our administration and my wife, the First Lady. Very clearly, you are welcome here. We are committed to your safety and well-being. We are walking towards the light together. We support your safety and well-being, and every resource of the state of Minnesota will be behind that. And more than anything, we support you and your right to practice your faith as you see fit in what it does to bring a better and one Minnesota. We will, in a very short time here, the holy month of Ramadan will be upon us. As Jaylani reminds me, I am very good at iftar, not so good at the fasting piece of this. So But I am learning, and we get out and we try and spend our Fridays in the communities and in our mosques, in our worship. But the one thing we think we're going to do, this has not been done before. My wife and I are going to be honored to host what we think is the first iftar at the governor's residence for our neighbors to come and see this. So I welcome you here. I wish you the best and insights that come out of this, knowing that our team is here to learn and to implement this, that one Minnesota doesn't mean we're all the same, but it means that we share a common humanity, we share common values, and that when we come together as one community to ensure peace and prosperity for all of us, we are better for that. So I thank you all for being here. I thank you for the leadership that's shown in this room and the commitment that Minnesota is only beginning, and we can be the ones who show the world just exactly what it looks like to exist in peace together to make prosperous communities. So I thank you all.
Thank you, Governor, President Ginny Arthur. I forgot to mention a little story. So I used to work here at Metro State University. All right? And I loved every minute that I was here. It was one of my difficult decisions to switch to CAIR, Minnesota. And I have to say, I worked with Ginny when she was the provost, and I would always leave Metro State, and there would always be one light up, that one office that had its light on at the upper floor here in this building. And it was always Ginny, and I was like, I tried to beat her so many times. President Ginny, I think Metro State is so lucky to have you and for your leadership and for having us here today. Without further ado, we will bring our first panelists. I want to just be very clear to all of you today. We have been struggling, and Heidi from SPLC could not make it today. Unfortunately, there's some challenges at our organization, and so she sends her apologies, and hopefully will be with us in future events. We are unfortunately male dominant at this first panel. We definitely apologize for that. We have been trying to fill this first panel all this past week and a half, and even till last night. So, but we really have amazing speakers, people who are really cutting-edge leaders, particularly on this topic, and hopefully you'll benefit. But the entire program, the rest of the program today, you will see that it's a balanced representation of our community. With that, I will bring our moderator from the Metro State University, Matt Filner, who is the Associate Professor at Political Science Department, and he will guide us through the next session.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. I have to apologize. As a professor, I think about these events in a professorial way. You're basically getting a semester's worth of education in a day. And it's an extraordinary event, an extraordinary opportunity, and you don't have to write any papers. So I just wanted to set a couple ground rules for this session. This will be a moderated discussion. So I'm going to be posing questions to our panelists, and as in their first answer, I'd ask them each to introduce themselves and their organization. You've already met Jaylani. And towards the end, we're going to have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So without further ado, I think it's important to start with this panel on the Islamophobia industry. We need to, I think, never forget that Islamophobia is not natural. It is not inevitable. It is manufactured, and it can be changed. And so without further ado, I just want to pose to the panel your thoughts on the Islamophobia industry. And we can, Abbas, you're first on the list. You want to start?
Good morning, everybody. Before we get started, if I could just ask you to join me in a round of applause for Jaylani and the CAIR Minnesota team and yourself for being here. You know, the United States is a diverse space. I think it was Was it you, Hatem, that said this morning it's really 50 countries, right? We've really got 50 countries, and Minnesota's really been doing some amazing work, even as it sits at the front lines of some of the worst Islamophobia in the country. So I really do commend you for forming such an infrastructure of a community and solidarity to even make an event like this possible. So I'll just say that my name is Abbas Barzegar. I am the Director of Research and Advocacy at CAIR National. And in my office's capacity, we really do explore ways to provide long-term solutions and frameworks for understanding the challenge of Islamophobia, and specifically what we might call the Islamophobia industry or the Islamophobia network. It is really important to understand the nature of the beast that we're wrestling here. And if you would indulge me for just a moment in a metaphor, I tend to think about Islamophobia and racism generally as a kind of climate problem, if you will. You know, if you think about our climate challenge, if you think about pollution, and if you think about climate change, you realize that we are in a lot of trouble. We have an acute crisis, like Flint, Michigan, for example, where the combination of environmental racism, climate change, and corporate greed and government negligence produce acute problems, and we have acute problems in Islamophobia by way of bullying, by way of attacks, like horrific ones, by the attacks that are threatened to our communities every single day. In our office, we receive those complaints. My office tracks and monitors sort of civil rights abuses and acts of discrimination around the country. But if we look at the origins and the source of this, like climate change, like pollution, we realize that there are some bad actors. But I'll tell you, once they pollute the air and that acid rain comes back down, you really do have a complex problem on your hand. Even if you were to shut down the factories today, if we were to implement all of the sort of the best metrics and best practices that we know to reverse this course of action, we would still be dealing with the oil spill that happened decades ago. And so how is it that we engage this kind of problem? Well, it is possible to overcome it. But you do have to realize that challenging Islamophobia doesn't come by simply by way of challenging a couple of bad actors on media or a couple of politicians here or there. We really do have to understand the infrastructure that's at play. And so what are those infrastructures? What are those things that contribute to the long-term pollution of our public space? In our office, we've been tracking the Islamophobia network. This is a group of individuals, actors that have very powerful pools of funding and political connections that are very, very organized and very deliberate in the way that they are manipulating our institutions around the world. So this Islamophobia network, you might know some of them, as Fox News commentators. You might hear them giving speeches, you might see some of their actions. But where is it that they're actually getting their funding from? Where is it that they're getting their power from? Who are their grassroots connections and things like that? Next week, we will be releasing a report that I believe will go further than most reports out there in exposing the funding networks behind the Islamophobia industry. In the past, what we've done, CAIR, and as well as stakeholders and allied communities around the country, in the past, what we've done is to monitor the strength of these organizations by looking at their financial power, right? And maybe looking at their connections to politicians and whatnot. This year, what we did was we made a very simple declaration and said, let us simply find out who is funding and who is receiving funding. Let us draw that map out and let's chart what the money flow looks like. So we can go from donor base all the way to media appearance or position in the White House. And what we found were things that most of us would already predict. Ideologically bad actors that are typically, and I'd say, like Brother Hatem knows here, 70 to 80% of these funders are somehow connected to defense industries associated with aggressive Zionist politics and policies. All right. Now, so these funding organizations, you're talking about people like Sheldon Adelson, all right, or Nina Rosenwald. These might not be average names to you, but they are powerful actors that align themselves with a far-right conservative agenda in this country. They use tax laws and philanthropic and charitable institutions in the United States that are really the hallmark of our of our civil society, they use those mechanisms to fund organizations that promote hate speech, encourage conspiracy theories, and I would say lend themselves to sort of violent actions and thoughts and sort of incite that type of thinking. And those organizations themselves hide underneath the cover of a 501c3. So what this means is that the same tax benefits that a food bank receives, Sheldon Adelson, a right-wing tycoon, all right, who's funding hate speech, and the hate actors themselves are benefiting in the same way that a food bank does. And the philanthropic institutions have now been so caught up in all of this that they've become victim, I believe, to the Islamophobia network. So put the Adelsons and the Rosenwalds behind. These were founders, of course, of American Charity. Nina Rosenwald is the granddaughter of one of the founders of Sears. So the same fund that she administers today funded Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. I mean, that's a disgrace, right? But forget about the ideological actors. What we find are mainstream institutions have now been caught up in this. Fidelity, Schwab, have institutions that are charitable vehicles. Those institutions are being exploited by these big donors and funding millions of dollars into the Islamophobia network. So how is it that we challenge this sort of thing? I can get into a little bit of that as we keep going. I'm going to stop there. But just think about the challenges that we face, and we'll get into the details. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. So I know we'll want to respond to lots of comments. I'm going to ask the panel to continue to discuss the Islamophobia industry before we get into response. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. It's great to be here. My name is Khaled Beydou, and I'm a law professor. I'm also the author of the book American-Islamic and I look at the Islamophobia network specifically from a legal lens. Abbas has just discussed, kind of the commercial dimension of the Islamophobia network. What I try to do is to theorize and frame how the law is spearheading much of the Islamophobia taking place today. So what I want to start by doing is provide you with kind of a general framework and a general frame of concepts that enable us to think about Islamophobia from a legal standpoint. First, it's critical to understand that above all, Islamophobia is private in nature. And what I mean by private in nature is that it's unleashed by private actors meaning individuals, hate mongers, like the terrorists in New Zealand, for instance, not acting on behalf of the state directly. These are individuals who are driven to engage in violence, driven to engage in bigotry, based on the presumption, the idea that expressions of Muslim identity are somehow tied to terrorism, somehow tied to invasion, somehow tied to ideas that this element cannot be assimilated. Also collapsing what Abbas just discussed, these private networks, whether it be organizations, whether it be pundits. These are individuals that are acting in a private capacity. That is the first dimension of Islamophobia that I sort of frame and talk about in my research in my book, private in nature. The second form is state-sponsored Islamophobia or structural Islamophobia. The same way we think about racism being individual in nature, but also institutional in nature, is the frame we need to adopt to understand Islamophobia. So when we talk about state-sponsored Islamophobia, what am I talking about specifically? I'm talking about laws, right? Things like the Patriot Act, which were enacted after 9/11, things like the Muslim ban, which was first an executive order signed by the president that eventually became a law upheld by the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court. Things like state action that isn't manifested in the form of actual law, legislation, or executive order. So items like rhetoric from the president qualify as state-sponsored Islamophobia. Ideas like provisions being passed by the House of Representatives which restrict Ilhan Omar from wearing the hijab in Congress, that is structural Islamophobia. And when we think about structural Islamophobia, it enables us to see that it's not only being unleashed and enacted by the right. We tend to caricature Islamophobia as a phenomenon or a form of bigotry that is exclusively coming from the right. But once we look at it as a state-sponsored enterprise, we see that the left regularly engages in Islamophobia as well. Classic example that I'm sure many of you are familiar with here in Minneapolis, the Twin Cities, counter-radicalization policing, right? Surveillance that is enacted by both the federal government but also municipal governments, right, was established by a liberal democratic administration, the Obama administration. So state-sponsored Islamophobia is critical to understand that, in my opinion, and again, I'm a law professor, so I might be biased, is the most potent sort of catalyst in disseminating and entrenching Islamophobia. Third, Islamophobia is also a dialectic, right? There's a synergy going on between what the state does, right? By virtue of the state passing these laws, the state engaging in this kind of state action, it's endorsing the negative sentiment held by private individuals, private hate mongers, and during times of crisis, it actually emboldens and authorizes greater violence, right? There's a synergy and a tie and a dynamic between what the state does and what private actors do. And we can see that very vividly in the manifesto of the terrorist in New Zealand, right? His overtures citing the travel ban, citing the headscarf ban in France, citing Trump as an inspiration, which again is really critical because it helps us hold the state culpable for the criminal and deviant actions of private Islamophobes. So I'll stop there, but I want to start off by laying that theoretical foundation that inshallah enables us to have a more fruitful conversation.
Thank you, Khaled. Jeff, your thoughts on the Islamophobia industry?
Well, my name is Todd Green. I am a professor of religion at Luther College in Iowa, Decorah, Iowa, just south of the Minnesota border, so this is kind of my backyard. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you to CAIR. Thank you for all the co-sponsors for participating and sponsoring this event. This is wonderful, and it's wonderful to see the amount of people who are here today. I'm a religious historian, and usually when I say that, people automatically start to fall asleep. But it's the angle I take when I study Islamophobia. This is my primary area of research. So one of my big things about Islamophobia is that Islamophobia is not something that's new, or certainly prejudice against Muslims, hostility toward Muslims, discrimination against Muslims is not even a post-9/11 phenomenon. There's a longer history to this, and I would argue, and will argue throughout the day in various sessions I'm a part of, that there are a lot of tropes, stereotypes employed against Muslims that have been employed against other religious minorities and racial minorities in the United States throughout its history, including Jews, Catholics, and so, to some extent even Mormons. So it's important to understand this is a rebranding of an old prejudice both against Muslims and against others who have been deemed as outsiders, who don't quite fit in or perceived as not fitting in, as belonging to us, right? And of course we have to think about who us is. The Islamophobia industry. One of the interesting things I've been thinking about the past few minutes is that probably all of us could tell personal stories about personal entanglements with members of the Islamophobia industry. This is not an abstract sort of area of study for most of us. It's very personal, and we have all received the attention of the Islamophobia industry and experienced what it's like to receive that attention, and very little that's good comes out of that when they focus on you individually. But I will say this about the Islamophobia industry. My particular area of interest is the tactics that they use. There are people on this panel who are better equipped in terms of the legal aspect or the funding, the impact locally here. But I'm interested in the kind of tactics they've been using, the arguments they use, and to what extent these have been succeeding or not. In most cases, they've actually been succeeding quite well. And there are 4 tactics in terms of the types of arguments used by this industry that I have been tracking over the past decade and seeing how they've changed and where they've been putting their energy and what sort of impact this has had on the political discourse in the United States. One of those is one has been around for a while. It's the notion of jihad, particularly violent forms of jihad, that Muslims are required by Islam to sort of assault and attack and kill and murder anyone who's not Muslim if they don't submit in order to impose some sort of violent political order. That's nothing new in terms of the past decade or so, and it's not something that's particular to the Islamophobia industry. More implicit forms of this were at work even in the justification for the war on terror. You know, the references to Islamic terrorism, Islamofascism, if you remember that from the Bush administration, those are all trying to draw on those stereotypes. So that's one that's been out there for a while. What we've seen in the past decade are 3 others that I've been tracking. One is the notion of civilization jihad, which is a favorite of Frank Gaffney. Frank Gaffney is the head of the Center for Security Policy, who has come to have a lot of influence in Washington. I'll talk about that in a moment. But Gaffney regularly harps on this notion of the Muslim Brotherhood, whom he believes CAIR is a front for, by the way, has infiltrated the United States and the federal government at the highest levels, including the White House, including the Department of Justice, including the State Department. And so what's happening here is you have seemingly nice Muslims who have decided to play along with the United States and the Constitution and infiltrate the nation. And once they're in great positions of power, then voila, right? We have the horrific, violent Islamic State that presumably they're trying to implement, and they're just trying to do this in a stealth way, as opposed to a more overtly violent way. I think this is also behind efforts by Senator Ted Cruz and others to label the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, and then any group that they can kind of tie to the Muslim Brotherhood, therefore, is a terrorist organization. It's meant to silence Muslim civil liberties groups and Muslim political groups and other activists who are trying to shape policy and trying to shape discourse when it comes to racism and bigotry. The third tactic I have been tracking is this notion of Sharia, creeping Sharia. You're all familiar with that as a stereotype as well, that Muslims are trying to impose some sort of horrific Islamic law on the rest of us. So, we have to be afraid of Sharia and whatever that means, but it's supposed to conjure up fear. There's no nuance whatsoever in terms of this conversation. It's been around for a while, but I will say this. I think it's been gaining traction significantly in the past several years, and I think the Islamophobia industry's efforts to do so have succeeded to a large degree. Even after New Zealand, I did a number of media interviews, and in the majority of those interviews, the journalist asked me a question about Sharia after New Zealand, right? That's the effect, that's the impact of the Islamophobia industry. They repeat this narrative enough, they promote it through their various networks, through their political networks, and sooner or later it sticks, and it has begun to stick, and now I find myself regularly trying to field questions about that, even though the news event is on something completely different. I will also say this about the whole Sharia narrative, is that last year the Republican National Committee and the Trump-Pence re-election website had a questionnaire on both of their websites, and one of the questions was about, do you fear the spread of Sharia? All right, so I think we can anticipate in the upcoming election cycle that will be deployed, and it could be deployed with great effect. So we need to keep that in mind in terms of countering the strategy. The final tactic I'll mention right now, then I will move the conversation along, is taqiyya. When I started doing this work, no one was talking about taqiyya really, but this idea that Muslims are required by Islam to deceive the rest of us in terms of their overall political efforts to impose Islam on the rest of the country. But we saw this gaining traction in the last election cycle. Ben Carson was notable for complaining that Muslims are required by Islam to deceive us in order to achieve their larger, more insidious political ends. And this is a talking point that comes right out of the Islamophobia industry. And that's my larger point. All four of those, you see these now being repeated in explicit and sometimes in implicit ways by presidential candidates, by people in positions of power. I can think of all sorts of tropes used in the last election cycle, from Muslim ID guards to registration systems to databases to Islam hates us to Muslim bans, that in many ways are drawing on these kinds of narratives that are coming right out of the Islamophobia industry. They have become quite powerful in a fairly short period of time, and it is something of great concern, and I'm glad that we're devoting an entire plenary session this morning to this industry.
Thank you, Todd. Jaylani, can you give us some Minnesota perspective? There should be two mics over there.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Yeah, for Minnesota, I would say, we actually recently produced a report on the network here in Minnesota, particularly, and with a large number of social justice groups, and that report is available online. But I would say, just in addition to the conversation, what we've noticed in Minnesota particularly is that, we do it Minnesota nice hate here. It's a passive-aggressive style. So there are three things that we look for. Obviously, the number one is the militia groups that have focused now on the Muslim community. There's a group called 3% Militia that have focused now on the Muslim community particularly. And what we found out from the bombing in Bloomington is that they were part of these militia groups who are much more militarized and have that type of focus. And they're probably the most dangerous of the groups. And then you have the second group, the mom and pop shops, usually very small, demographically older in age. And these are the groups that usually either stem from either religious-based groups or places like veterans, VFWs. So if you come to the greater Minnesota panel, I think you'll hear more about it specifically because in Minnesota, we see that activity happening in St. Cloud, in the central region of the state, and also the northern region of the state. And we're also seeing that type of these groups becoming much, much more aggressive, but mostly well organized and working together. So if there's an anti-Muslim speaker who comes to Minnesota, he's going to go to 6 towns, and all those 6 towns, there's groups that are rallying those people. And usually it's like 5 to 6 people, but they get these people together. And so that level of the mom and pop shop type of small group of hate groups are really the biggest ones that are impacting. There was, for example, policies that they've been pushing, particularly in St. Cloud, in St. Croix, and actually here in our neighboring Wisconsin. And what we're seeing is that these groups then put a lot of the information online, and they are now attacking, obviously, my organization and many of the other organizations. So when we actually put that earlier report that I mentioned, all of the groups that were able to sign on and be part of that report were all attacked online. Their names of their organizations were put online. And what we're also seeing in Minnesota particularly is some form of increased hostility. I mean, I know how to engage these people, as Todd mentioned a little earlier. You know, they would show up and we would try to talk to them or have a conversation with them. And most recently, we had a conversation at the Minnesota Historical Society about the Somali culture, of all things, and Islam. And there was a group that came, and I've seen this group multiple times. But for the first time, they started to actually militarily, tactically stop me from leaving the building to a certain extent. And then when I left, one of them was stupid enough, to actually personally threaten me to say that he's going to come after me and make it look like it's an accident. And so we're now concerned about what's the relationship between the actual militia groups that actually have that type of militarized and these groups that are just like to come to events like even here today, who will try to pass information out. But I would say the industry is growing because of dark money. It's growing because of people who are extremely wealthy, who are giving funding to these organizations, who it will be very difficult for us to find out who these people are. And while, yes, there are, right now in the conservative right, we see a lot of them there, but we also see a great deal on the progressive left as well. And again, the issue goes back to what Todd mentioned just a minute ago about security and fear. And that's why the Islamophobia, this idea of irrational fear, is really important, because easily people slip into that. And so, but I think we're starting to see a little bit of a change, and I think that's some of the hope that we can also talk about.
Thank you. So when we study industries, we tend to think about industries as having a vertical position from the very top all the way down to the most grassroots. And we also think about industries as being horizontal in terms of covering a wide variety of people and institutions. Can you talk about how the Islamophobia industry is both vertical, reaching from the donors all the way down to the grassroots, or maybe vice versa, and also horizontal across groups, across states, across institutions? Abbas, maybe you'd like to start us?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, I think it's an interesting way to think about it. You know, the industry, if you will, definitely has top donors that are fueling it, and you could think about them. I imagine that they do sit around and talk about how they're going to advance a certain agenda, or they're aware of what they're doing, and because they're very deliberate, they're very effective. And when you look at the activities that they're engaged in, it does seem like they are moving in a very concrete sort of tandem way where they're accenting and helping one another. So one of the ways I think that this really works out at the vertical and horizontal level is a fellow named David Yerushalmi. Now, all these organizations sound the same. It's like Americans for a Better America, you know.
America for America.
You know what I mean? And it's really interesting. So even though I study this stuff constantly, I always get the acronyms turned around and whatnot. But David Yerushalmi is a fellow who focuses exclusively what he calls lawfare, and a strategy to basically bring bogus cases to court and advance bogus legislation. So if you look at his funding networks and his funding capacity, it does come from the major actors, which use, what Jaylani mentioned here, dark money institutions. This is very important to recognize, and I'll stop here for a second and explain what this mechanism looks like. There's a institution in kind of the tax and charity world called a donor advised fund, okay? A DAF, a donor advised fund, and outside of the conversation on Islamophobia, many ethicists out there are very concerned about the rise of this institution in disrupting the American tradition of philanthropy, because basically what it does is, I want to donate to CAIR, okay? But I don't want anybody to know that I donated to CAIR. So I donate to a donor advised fund, which might be housed in something as good-natured as, the California Community Foundation, or Fidelity or Schwab. I've got my bank with Fidelity, so I might as well use that institution. I tell them where I want to donate to. They're donating to tens of thousands of institutions. They have no mechanism to see where it's going. So they donate straight to Frank Gaffney or Yerushalmi. I get my tax break and my donation receipt from Fidelity or Schwab. And on the other side of it, they see, Yerushalmi only gets the money from Fidelity or Schwab. So what this does is it breaks the transparency of American philanthropy, which is really part of the tradition, is that we wanted to be patrons of our public sphere. We wanted to take responsibility for it. And now you have these commercial conglomerates that are doing that. That funding goes into that space in a vertical way. But somebody like Yerushalmi advances legislation in partnership with somebody like Gaffney across the United States, and they approach state legislatures in places that are easy to win, and they pass absolutely junk resolution, either concrete legislation or resolutions that are actually just false. They are lies. There's a southern state, that recently passed a resolution against us, against CAIR. And it is factually incorrect. I mean, we can document why it is. We're not talking about half-truths here. This is absolutely wrong. The same thing happened in Congress just recently, a resolution attacking an American Muslim humanitarian organization. It is absolutely false. I mean, I can't say anything else, that it is absolutely wrong. And what's amazing is that, thinking about how this works vertically and horizontally, is that the resolution cites journalists for its sources that are also paid for by the network. All right, and the journalists, so-called journalists, are pumping out the same lies every single week. There's a guy who's on the payroll of Daniel Pipes' organization. He's pumping out the same lie over and over and over again. So when I see the resolution that's introduced against this Muslim institution, I see the language that's in it. I know who wrote it because I've been reading this guy's articles. And so you can actually see the coordination there. It's extremely sophisticated, all right? Think about what it takes to put something like that together, and think about the opportunity costs that it takes to fight something like that together. But really, as bad as it is, we do have to spend the time to recognize their tactics and understand the way that they operate.
Yeah. And it seems like some of those resolutions are addressing some of the tropes that Todd described, some of the tropes about Sharia and civilization, and increasingly we're going to see that in state legislatures all across the country. Yeah. Todd?
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add. That was a great explanation, I think. I think I was thinking in terms of the way you were putting it, the vertical the reach, right? In terms of traveling around the country and speaking to a lot of different publics in the United States on Islamophobia for some years now, the tropes I mentioned earlier, I've seen gain more and more traction. And so it's not uncommon in a Q&A for an audience to someone to start invoking language that could come right out of Robert Spencer, right? But I've also found that they don't often know that. So they don't know quite the source of, they can't trace the genealogy of these ideas, because they've been reproduced in so many complex ways. And frankly, we haven't mentioned this yet, but the Islamophobia industry is very savvy with social media, far more than most of us who are countering it, and are very good at spreading their message in that way, and have very platforms that really spread their narratives far and wide. much more than I used to really take seriously, but I take it very seriously now. And so I have encountered, in terms of the reach of this industry into places in America, into populations who are repeating these tropes. Maybe they read it on the internet somewhere, but the language itself is coming right out of a Pamela Geller or a Frank Gaffney or Robert Spencer. So that vertical reach from top to bottom, right? I mean, it's quite pervasive, and that's one of the reasons I've become so alarmed by it.
And Khaled, can you talk about the horizontal legal changes, laws you're seeing, whether it's at the state level or local level, where you're seeing changes in law that might help to institute the Gaffney perspective?
Yeah, I'll address that, but I think to kind of like launch the statement, it's really critical. There's one takeaway I want folks to walk away with today, is to not think about Islamophobia as exclusively irrational, right? It's typically irrational when it's coming from private actors, but when it's the state, when it's corporations, when it's actual industries, it's very rational, right? Their objective is to effectively disseminate a specific portrayal of Islam and of Muslims to achieve and to attain specific objectives, whether political, whether legal, whether economic. That is entirely rational, right? When we think about rationalism, that is the very definition of rationalism. So I personally don't like the term Islamophobia industry. I think it's far too monolithic a concept. I think it's far too limited a frame. I like the framing of Islamophobia network, because it allows us to think about how the state actually impacts what corporations are doing, what pundits are doing, what the media is doing. It's far more interconnected than it is, one sort of homogenous actor. So when we think about it horizontally speaking, we can look at how big donors that Abbas is telling us about are funding pundits, funding think tanks to construct and to conjure up specific narratives and to produce scholarship that is wrong about Muslims, right? Scholarship that 100 years ago was analogous to eugenics science, right? That's saying that specific racial groups are inferior, specific groups of people are subordinate and can't be assimilated. That body of research, that body of scholarship is doing the same thing. It's saying things like Muslims are inherently inassimilable. They can't be conformed with American society because their objective is to take over American society. And that research then abets and enables politicians, especially individuals within state power, to then pass on legislation, to pass bills that effectively say the same thing, right? We can look at even before the rise of Trump, with the rise of the Tea Party, they were really effective with spearheading this anti-Sharia movement, right? In 2010, 2011, there were something like 200 bills across the country being spread that effectively looked to cast Sharia law as being, criminal, deviant, and inassimilable with American law. And by the way, I teach First Amendment law. There's no need for such a bill because the First Amendment Establishment Clause restricts, right, the enshrinement of any religious body or any religious law, whether it be Muslim, Jewish, or Christian. So it's entirely idiotic. It's entirely absurd. It's political in nature because it mobilizes voters, right? That's what this bill does. It mobilizes voters to effectively vote for right-wing politicians and entrench their influence. Abbas mentioned another law that is on the books right now in the state in which I teach, Arkansas. The state of Arkansas is looking to criminalize and outlaw CAIR, the organization, even though CAIR doesn't have a chapter within the state of Arkansas, right? Which is crazy, right? It's looking like, for instance, looking to ban the NRA in a state where the NRA doesn't exist. It's completely idiotic, completely absurd, but it's an effective political tool because what that does is the politician who is wielding that bill can effectively raise it when he's running for office next time and say, look, I look to criminalize Muslims from this state, vote for me, it's effective. That's the horizontal chain in which the private actors, the private donors fund the pundits, fund the researchers, who then provide these politicians with the intellectual, or in this respect, anti-intellectual ammunition to pass bills that go ahead and entrench their presence within government.
Jaylani, can you talk a little bit about how you see imports into Minnesota of ideas, whether the Adelson's ideas or the Gaffney's ideas?
Well, one of the interesting things is that Minnesota, Minnesota is not really, trying to get the right words out.
Not unique.
Minnesota is a good state. let's just say that.
It's not unique?
It's unique, but it's a good state, and I think it has a lot of wonderful people here. However, I think the Muslim community in Minnesota has become a target for all the Islamophobia network. In fact, there was a blogger, several bloggers, who came and harassed the Dar Farouk Mosque just a couple of weeks ago. And one of those bloggers actually made a false police report by creating a fake Twitter account and then made a threat to himself from that Twitter account and raised money online. And so all of the Islamophobia networks are using this community as a scapegoat and as an example to launch their efforts elsewhere else. And it's really the success in Minnesota that they are fighting. The success of the Muslim community here in Minnesota, the success of the fact that we had the first Congressman, Keith Ellison, and now Ilhan Omar, and the success that we're seeing in the state is becoming a problem. So all of the talking points are, look, in Minnesota has, or these areas have no-go zones and as much of that. So, and I fear that because the folks that attacked our mosque in Bloomington came from Illinois. And the question we kept asking ourselves, and we're still asking the FBI, is how did they target this specific mosque? And for most people, going back to the moms and pop shop type of hate groups who don't know what they're doing, but they do know what they're doing, there's a group called Friends of Smith Park. Most of you in here don't know what that is because it sounds like a nice group to join. Friends of Smith Park. And the reality is Smith Park is adjacent to the Dar Farouk Islamic Center. And it's a group which really is just 2 people, I think, or less. And they have literally created an image of that building and that community. And they continually document this online. And so a few years back, the Pama Gellhards of the world, the network actually picked it up and it became a huge headline. And so that's why we believe that those, I mean, that's the only logical for us to think about, that because of these articles from Friends with Smith Park that connected to this larger network, that when these guys decided to target a mosque, they passed probably like a couple hundred mosques on their way to that specific mosque, right? And so, you know, that's one of the things that I would just say that in Minnesota, outside, I mean, there are challenges, obviously, and I think St. Cloud is an area that is struggling. I think there is tremendous progress that's happening with the efforts from Unite Cloud, the Muslim community, the interfaith groups, the social justice groups. There's a lot of good things happening in St. Cloud that I don't want you to not understand, but St. Cloud is still a very difficult place. And one of the things that we really need, and this is the reason why we keep doing these conferences, is we really need the actual folks in St. Cloud, the big stakeholders, the Catholic Church, the other groups that are there in St. Cloud that have prominent roles to take serious leadership. And the problem right now is as soon as something happens, these major stakeholders are backing out. And even politicians are afraid to step forward and to push this back. And the reality is most people are making decisions with very limited basic information. Yeah. But at the same time, I believe that these groups project themselves to be very powerful because we kind of allow that to that extent.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to the theme that Abbas raised at the beginning, the theme of pollution and the way in which we're all affected and we're all, in effect, polluted by Islamophobia and how little information most people know. When you think about climate change, we each are maybe naive about the ways we contribute to climate change, what role we each play in the network of climate change. And recognizing, you know, that you're driving a car may contribute to climate change might lead to change individually. So can you talk a little bit about what you think people maybe unknowingly do to contribute to the network? You know, I think it's clear Gaffney's a bad actor, right? I think the worst actions are most problematic, but we're also polluted by it. So how are people who maybe are unaware contributing to the network? Jaylani, do you want to start? So
this is the one thing that I'm preaching, and I hope all of you who listen today can at least do this. The space usually that is extremely toxic is social media. And what I keep finding is allies, advocates have fear of saying something. The silence is killing us. And the reality is usually the Islamophobes have very opinionated laced questions that they throw out. And most of our allies are trying to answer that with an intelligent answer. Like trying to decipher what this question means, how can you balance it, what is the right approach. How many of you have actually done in a comment section, type, then delete it. type, then delete it. And then you're like, I'm gonna go. That's what we all do. We have to completely change that. And I'm gonna give you the answer. If you don't have the time to figure out something smart to say, just say something. Let's fill the comment section with something positive, hopeful, a quote, something. We cannot allow hate groups to dominate these spaces. In fact, nobody reads the articles anymore. They just go directly to the comment section. And then what happens is when you do a comment section, somebody's gonna come after you, right? And then you're gonna get now emotionally tied to this comment, and you're gonna go fight for that. That happens all the time. I mean, Facebook wars, right? So my biggest thing is if we can get majority of people, when they see racism and bigotry, call it out, say something, and then walk away. Don't carry that with you the rest of the day, because otherwise you're gonna get emotionally connected and you're not gonna do it again. And once you do that, guess what? You show the other person behind you what does it look like to oppose hate on social media. Go to any Fox 9, Channel 4, any of the local TV. If any story comes about the Muslim community, just check the stream. Even in our New Zealand press conference that we had here, you could just see people just like literally going off. Now, there are people obviously responding, but a lot of times people don't know what is appropriate. And I would say the silence is the biggest problem, and it's something that every single person can do something about.
Thank you. Todd?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you. Those are very well said. I would like to pick up on that because I'm not Muslim. I seek to be an ally. The audiences I primarily try to reach are my people. And why is that? Because Islamophobia does not emanate from Muslims any more than anti-Semitism emanates from Jews. In the United States of America, it's the non-Muslim majority that's responsible for this. But there is a lot of silence, and we remember Dr. King's words that silence is complicity, right? If you're silent, you have taken a side. You've taken the side of the status quo, and the status quo with Islamophobia right now is horrific. That is not a legitimate side to take. You can't both sides Islamophobia, okay? So that is a difficult thing to do in America right now, and on November the 9th, 2016, that was the day after the election, I thought a lot about this question of why are things getting worse? By almost every metric, Islamophobia is getting worse. Why? And who we talk to and who we try to get encouraged to speak out is very important here. Najeeba Saeed, a friend of mine, a Muslim activist and scholar, wrote a piece about this a couple of months ago on Sojourners, where she said Christians, white Christians included, need to be speaking with other Christians. We need to be talking to each other about Islamophobia. It's great to talk to Muslims. I love talking to Muslims. They get it pretty quickly, right? But people with my background don't. Particularly the point, and this is a harder one to make, so bear with me, about what is Islamophobia? Is Islamophobia primarily ignorance? Islamophobia is ignorance, and that needs to be addressed, and there are lots of organizations that do such a great job, including here in the Twin Cities, organizations like the Islamic Resource Group, about trying to educate the public on Islam, its rituals, its teachings, its traditions, et cetera, right? And this is important work. But we must also understand that to address Islamophobia, we can't only do Islam 101 talks. Because Islamophobia is not primarily ignorance, even though it is ignorance, it's racism. This is anti-racism work. That's what makes it so difficult to call attention to this to the non-Muslim majority, because you're asking them, or I'm trying to ask them and myself, what are we doing that's complicit in this work that makes the Islamophobia industry's works so effective? Through our silence or through our inability to recognize the everyday practices, our voting patterns, everything that contribute to a political order. Here in the United States, and I would say globally as well, US imperialism is connected to this. That sustains Islamophobia, that sustains this form of racism. So just remember, one big takeaway I want us to have from this is that Islamophobia is not just about not knowing stuff about Islam. You can know a lot of things about Islam and still be a bigot. The name of such a person is Robert Spencer. Mm-hmm. He knows the 5 pillars of Islam. He can quote the Quran. He can quote from the Hadith. He knows information. He's able to pick from different pieces of Islam and then wield a picture, right, of Islam portrayed in its worst light. with him dictating that narrative. So knowing information about Islam is not enough. Knowing that this is racism and that it emanates from the majority population, the majority population is the one that needs to be addressed, and that those of us who are seeking to be allies need to be speaking more to these populations and to these publics, and raising the bar higher when it comes to how we address Islamophobia, which I think will help in pushing back on the Islamophobia industry. The bar can't get any lower. Mm-hmm. And I fear too many of us, even who are seek to be allies, have not raised the bar enough with other non-Muslim, particularly white Americans and white Christian Americans, who struggle to come to terms with their history of racism, the history of white supremacy, the history of white violence, white Christian violence, which is one of my big talking points, because what the Islamophobia industry has done so well is distract us. That's fundamentally what racism is. Toni Morrison said this so well several decades ago. The very serious function of racism, according to Morrison, is distraction. The Islamophobia industry is a master at distraction, and we got to stop being distracted and start paying attention to all the other stuff that we're not looking at that we should be.
Thank you. Khaled?
Yeah, I'll just say really briefly, I'm really glad Todd brought up the phrase that had been unsaid until he said it, white supremacy. And it's really critical to think about Islamophobia as a tentacle and an emanation of white supremacy. And once we understand Islamophobia as a extension of white supremacy, we see that it's far more entrenched and far more extended than it is a novel phenomenon, right? Before there was a Muslim ban being signed by Trump, there was a first Muslim ban that stood from 1790 to 1944 that restricted Muslims from becoming naturalized citizens, right? There was this civilizational sort of epistemology and narrative that Muslims and Islam was not a bona fide religion, but a political ideology and a civilization that was entirely antithetical to American identity and American values. Before there was an Islamophobia, there was actually Orientalism, right? Who knows what Orientalism is? Right, so it's this system, it's this master discourse that effectively seeds, right? It seeds these really key stereotypes that go on and feed the manufacturing and perpetuation of anti-Muslim tropes today. And third, most important, I think, it's critical to understand, and I think Todd brought up another important point, that knowledge about Islam can in fact actually breed and engender greater Islamophobia. Right, and we see that from the state, especially when we look at counter-radicalization policing. The last administration was as knowledgeable about Islam as any administration before it, and they used that knowledge to further state-sponsored Islamophobic ventures like countering violent extremism. Specifically in Detroit, where I come from, they used that knowledge to put specific sects, right? So they picked the Shia Muslim community against the Sunni Muslim community to advance surveillance. So this idea that knowledge actually entrenches and erodes Islamophobic views is very much a myth and a misnomer, especially when we're talking about more advanced and more intelligent factions of the Islamophobia network. So again, critical to think about Islamophobia as a white supremacist project, right? Really critical because it helps us understand that part of the project of this white supremacist idea is to minimize brown faces and to minimize brown and non-Christian believers, right? Especially during this moment of considerable demographic shifts. This country is predicted to be majority-minority in 2043, which is intensifying considerable white anxiety, white paranoia. And a main reason why this administration has been so effective in popularizing ideas like the Mexico walls, the Muslim bans, things of that nature, is because the objective is to maintain the white majoritarian integrity of the country, and Islamophobia helps deliver that promise and that greater objective.
Thank you. Yeah, I was struck by thinking about white supremacy over American history, and you mentioned that CAIR is being there's a lawsuit to keep, or a bill to keep CAIR out of Arkansas, I think. The NAACP versus Alabama is a case in which Alabama outlawed the NAACP, and the Supreme Court actually ruled for the NAACP. And you know, it's the same thing. It's the same issue, repeated in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say this before the next round. I will say that one of the spaces that we fail in, that we could do better in, is to not allow the debates of the Islamophobic network that they tried to frame the debates around Islam, around Muslims, and around world affairs. We cannot allow them to dominate those debates. A lot of the silence that you hear coming from our side is not out of like even a fear of a backlash, I believe that we're unequipped and often flat-footed to deal with the complexity of issues that are out there. So what ends up happening is that we know something's racist, we hear it racist, but we can't actually fight on their terms or argue on their terms because the way that they framed it. And so, for example, we know that the phrase black on black violence is a racist framework, all right? That is a way of obfuscating state responsibility and particular responsibility to do historic justice to black communities in the United States. But if somebody falls into the trap of talking about black on black violence and gang violence instead of historical discrimination, historical disenfranchisement, if we allow that frame to go forward, we lose and cede the battle. In the same way, when we talk about sort of Islamophobia or jihad, the Sharia, they're often more knowledgeable than even people in our own community, even the Muslim community, to be able to debate those things on those terms. And so I do believe that in addition to mobilizing our solidarity and our positive affection and being willing to stand up to things, we do actually have to equip ourselves to be able to engage these debates in a more sophisticated way, which is why we have to make better use of our scholars, our teachers, our researchers and professors to really absorb that knowledge and not be afraid to jump into understanding the complexities of the world that are out there. It is linked to imperialism, it is linked to white supremacy, it is complex, but we have to create the bandwidth to educate ourselves so that we can fight back.
Yeah. Thank you. So we have a couple minutes to entertain some audience questions. Is there someone who has a question that would like to ask the panel over here? And I'd ask you, just for the interest of time, to keep the question brief. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Mustafa Diri. I'm a community organizer and family advocate. My question is, how, I don't know if you guys touched this, but how you guys talk about the media, especially the local media. I think they're one of the driving forces of Islamophobia, about that case that 100 million daily go through airport, and also, can you elaborate that? Thank you.
Yeah, a question about the role of the media. And take one more question, and then we'll have the panel talk about it. There's a question in the back.
Hi, in Minnesota and St. Cloud, refugee is often synonymous with Muslim, and I'm just wondering how that is tied into everything.
Thank you. So we have a question about the media and a question about the term refugee as sort of a proxy term. Jaylani, do you want to start?
So I don't know if any of you remember, Fox 9 did a story that said that there's $100 million being defrauded, and that money was going to Somalia. And it started immediately a witch hunt and a bunch of hearings at the Capitol. Fox 9 eventually backtracked. We had multiple conversations with them about this. And then just a few weeks ago, a report came out that said, factually, all of those things were incorrect. But that story and all similar stories are actually reappear on social media all the time. And that's one of the strategies of, of this network, is to project that this community is violent, and so anything that's close to that will be projected. As far as the mention around in Minnesota, particularly when it comes to the Muslims and immigrants, actually that's one of the ways to disguise anti-Muslim legislation. So in Minnesota, one of the parties was running on this: we're going to stop immigrants from coming to Minnesota. And that platform was really about Muslims, because they weren't really talking about other immigrants to a specific, because in rural Minnesota, the conversation about immigrants that are a threat to the community are the Muslim community. There are articles every single day, op-eds written about this. In fact, this is something many people don't know. In Minnesota, we probably are around 40 or 50 op-eds against the Muslim community that appear every year, or percentage-wise, than one positive op-ed. And most people here in the Twin Cities are like, well, I don't see them. The reality is all of them are happening in small rural towns, papers, that's where they're really getting pumped out. And it's the same writing. In fact, some of those op-eds, if you just do just a word search, you'll find that the same exact op-ed was published in Florida somewhere else. Even that it was not even their words. Like, they just reprinted and reshuffled the same talking points. So particularly the language in Minnesota. And also Somali may mean Muslim too. So a lot of people will say, are you Somali, looking at someone who is white, who's wearing a hijab. And that's part of the ignorance, but it's also the racialization of Islamophobia to an extent.
Thank you. Abbas?
I could say something about the refugee issue. Yeah. It's not only here that the term refugee is synonymous with Muslim and then somehow disparaging. What I've been confused about is why that media space is so dominated by the right, because in the refugee resettlement work that happens across this country, you find some of the most powerful stories of American civil society coming together. You all know this here. It is in refugee resettlement and the hosting of people that are coming from other parts of this country where we see the best of America. We really do see churches, secular groups, civil society groups, children. We see people coming together on a regular basis to uplift, contribute, and really do some amazing work. I don't understand why we don't have greater media capacity around the storytelling that should go there. Literally, in today's age, I've been encouraging humanitarian organizations, resettlement agencies to outfit themselves with better storytelling capacity in that regard. That, to me, is a very easy frame to overcome. And I would just encourage those that are in that work to, consider just a little bit of investment in that way.
And pitching those stories to the media.
Absolutely.
So that having professionals who are working with them.
Absolutely. They're great stories. It's great work to be done. And again, local media, that's perfect.
Yeah. Boss? Todd?
I'll just say really briefly. So the use of proxies by the media is actually a lesson that's been learned from the law. So the reason the media uses proxies like refugees to effectively serve for Muslims in that instance is because it qualifies as facially neutral. And the law has done that for a long time, because by use of proxies in legislation, by use of proxies in executive orders, it enables the state actor, the maker of that law, to effectively avoid the highest form of scrutiny from the court. So the media is actually emulating what the law has been doing for a long time, to appear tolerant, to appear non-racist, to appear non-bigoted, and to effectively steer away from the highest forms of public scrutiny. So it's another highlight of the way in which there's a really interesting dialectic between private actors, this instance, the media, with what the law and the courts have been doing for a long time.
Yeah, two things on the conflation of refugees, particularly immigrants, Muslims. I think of the Muslim ban comes to my mind. And I still cannot shake the conviction that the Muslim ban was not just about refugees and immigrants from outside our borders. It's about Muslims within our borders. The two are connected. Immigration policy and domestic policy towards marginalized groups are almost always connected. That was an attempted political victory targeting many people who are sitting in this room. It's a scary thought, but that's when you're fighting the Muslim ban, you're definitely fighting real consequences abroad in terms of the impact this has on other countries, but you're pushing back against policy that is meant to demonize Muslim Americans.
Well, especially when it's paired with an effort to delegitimize citizenship.
Oh, absolutely.
And to remove citizenship rights from people who have been naturalized.
And who is us and who is them, right?
Yes.
And which is a classic, long-standing historical battle. In terms of the media, I'm trying to say something positive here, particularly about mainstream national media. I've grown very cynical of mainstream media, and maybe I'm not the best person to inspire you on this. Other than that, at least we should be very careful here, because the mainstream media is basically corporate media. Corporate media interest and state interest are very much intertwined. I've learned more and more to approach mainstream media outlets as state media outlets. I was once criticized for giving an interview to a state media outlet in Turkey, and that's fine if you wanted to criticize me for that. But if I give an interview to CNN or the New York Times, I feel like I'm also kind of giving an interview to state media as well. In terms of the deep-rooted political interest, U.S. interest, I can just mention Iraq War and how many media outlets jumped on board that very quickly, right? I've grown very, very suspicious of how we can change that. And most critical media studies confirm the same thing. The way mainstream media frames Islam, particularly in terms of violence and terrorism, is incredibly disproportionate in terms of, say, for example, right-wing extremism, as opposed to people with a Muslim background who actually aren't responsible for a particularly high percentage of terrorist attacks. So that's just one example, right? right? But it's hard to push back on mainstream media narratives. Local media, I have a little bit more optimism for, particularly if you can build relationships with journalists that you have access to in a city or a town, can make a difference over the long run, and it takes time to invest in that. In terms, I am skeptical about the media. We have to push back on this, but I don't see the media as the primary source of Islamophobia. It's a mechanism. It's a mechanism. I'm not losing sleep at night over whether Jake Tapper of CNN or whatever is the cause of Islamophobia. But unwittingly, sometimes folks like that can serve as a mouthpiece for Islamophobia because of the deeper rooted interest that corporate media has in terms of the United States and its own foreign and domestic policies and priorities. And that's what we need to start calling attention to in terms of the structural nature of Islamophobia and its relationship to the media.
Thank you. I think we have time. Do we have time for one more question? Anyone have in the middle?
Hello, Bilal Al-Katout here, Palestinian American. Just wondering, you haven't spoken to the role of Zionism or evangelical institutions in upholding Islamophobia. What are the roles?
So, if I can broaden that question a little bit, what is the role of specifically religious institutions, religious organizations, other religions in contributing to the industry? It's a complex story, so we don't have time to fully nuance that story, but maybe have a couple comments.
Yeah, and there are people here who do better work on this than I do. I can speak very quickly to evangelical Christians, particularly of my generation and older, who are very much invested in a certain policy when it comes to Israel, and therefore certain policies against Palestinians that very much feed the Islamophobia industry and the broader narratives of Islamophobia that we should be continuing to pay attention to. And the reason we should particularly call out this group, and again, there is exceptions within evangelical Christians, absolutely. But in terms of a broader sense here, this is important because if you remember, and all of you will remember not long ago, a couple of controversies involving Representative Omar, when she criticized AIPAC, right, you don't have to know much about AIPAC to know that evangelical Christians are very much invested in AIPAC, right? This is not a Jewish organization. There are plenty of Jews who are critical of AIPAC. But in the media, and in the larger political narrative, including in the Democratic Party, I dare say, all of that got conflated with the Jews, and therefore her comments were interpreted in the worst possible light, as opposed to what I thought she was trying to engage in, which was a very nuanced debate about U.S. policy toward Israel and who benefits from this, which would include evangelical Christians. So calling attention to that piece of this larger puzzle, I think, is quite significant to addressing Islamophobia, including the Islamophobia that drove the controversy over Representative Omar's comments that were framed as anti-Semitic.
Thank you.
I think one thing that we should just know is that Islamophobia can be found in any group. And in fact, I would say almost every group has Islamophobes. Even last year's conference, I had to deal with someone who attended the conference who had a hard time understanding that Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is seen on the more progressive left side of talking spaces, is an Islamophobe. Agreed that Pamela Gellhardt is Islamophobe, but not Ayaan Hirsi Ali, even though they share the same stage, say the exact same things. So I think one of those things is looking into our own communities to recognize that those voices do exist. I would say, though, that when you poll, particularly the Jewish community in America, they know more about Islamophobia than most people. The first calls I get in my office are from the Jewish community. At our press conferences last week, we had almost a third of the people who showed up were Jewish Americans who stood with the Muslim community. In fact, there was a poll that was a study that was done that asked communities of faith, are Muslims coming under some form of prejudice? And Muslims themselves said 60%, but the Jewish community said 66%. And the only way to explain that is to know that the Jewish community, because they're dealing with anti-Semitism, they understand the issues is not an anomaly issue. So I think one thing we have to recognize is that we have to quantify and understand the threat from white nationalism, and which, by the way, is a great introduction to the next panel right after this. But I think some of us, we need to really understand that Islamophobia can be found in all of our communities, and we have to be able to root it out.
Did you want to add to it? Okay. Khaled?
So specifically Zionism, that isn't necessarily a religious project, right? So many Zionists, and oftentimes the most prominent and effective Zionists, are in fact secular. So we shouldn't necessarily conflate religiosity with Zionism. That's really important, right? So it's important to identify that above all. Second, I'm gonna be short, but I really want everybody to go to Google and to look up an article written by Hatem Bazayan, who brilliantly deconstructs this relationship between Zionism and the Islamophobia network here stateside. If there's any work that has really tackled that question in a really trenchant way, it's that piece. So I can't articulate what he says in that piece, but I highly recommend reading that piece.
So you can mention.
Hatem Bazayan, he's with us today.
Yeah.
He'll reference it in his piece.
Come to the other panel.
But a really great piece.
I think we need to finish our session. The next session starts at 10:30, I believe, and there's a break now. So thank you to our panelists.
Congress is on the last week of its